My name is Claire Donovan. I'm 34, and for most of my life, I measured trust the way I measure a building, load by load, beam by beam, never assuming a structure can hold more weight than it was built for. I learned the hard way that people don't follow the same rules I do. I'd been gone 4 days, up in Aspen, walking a hillside lot with a client who wanted a house built into a slope nobody else would touch. That's the work I do. I take impossible sights and make them stand. I flew home Thursday night, tired in that specific way that comes from talking a nervous client out of a decision they'd regret for a decade, and all I wanted was my own bed. The house was quiet when I let myself in. Nothing broken. Nothing knocked over. That was the part that should have warned me sooner. The absence of damage. People assume a violation announces itself. Mine didn't. It was almost midnight before I walked into my closet to change, and that's when I saw it. The small steel door behind my coats, the one I'd had bolted into the wall myself 2 summers ago, the one only I was supposed to know the combination to, except I hadn't changed that combination since the year my sister lived with me. It was open, not forced, not pried at the seam, just open, the way a door looks when someone who already knows the numbers walks up and turns the dial without hesitating. I don't remember kneeling down. I remember my knees already on the floor, my hand already inside, already understanding before my fingers found the empty velvet box that what I was looking for wasn't going to be there. My grandmother's brooch, sapphire and diamond, set sometime in the 1940s, appraised 3 different times in my lifetime and insured separately from everything else I own, because everyone who ever looked at it agreed on one thing: it wasn't replaceable by money, even though money was the only language some people in my family ever really spoke. I pulled up the security app on my phone with hands that weren't quite steady. One entry, time-stamped the second afternoon I was gone, a code I didn't recognize at the front door, deactivated 30 seconds later like whoever used it knew exactly how long they had. I sat on my closet floor for almost 10 minutes before I called anyone. Not because I didn't understand what had happened, because some small, stupid, hopeful part of me was doing the math on who else had ever known that combination, and there was only one name on that list. Before I tell you what the camera actually showed, and why the person who took it genuinely believed they had every right to, tell me, where are you right now? Listening to this. What does the clock say where you are? I'm always curious how far a story like this ends up traveling. To understand why I sat on that floor doing math instead of screaming, you have to understand my sister. Paige is 4 years younger than me, and for most of our adult lives, I was the one who showed up when things broke. Not metaphorically. I mean the actual, recurring, exhausting kind of broke. The first time was her senior year of college, when a roommate situation collapsed, and she called me crying from a parking lot at 11 at night with nowhere to sleep. I drove 3 hours. I didn't think twice. After that, it became a pattern I told myself was just being a good sister. I co-signed an apartment lease when her credit wasn't strong enough on its own. I covered 2 months of rent the year she lost a retail management job to a corporate restructuring she had no control over. When her car got repossessed, I didn't ask questions before I handed her the keys to a loaner. And for almost 8 months, 3 years ago, she lived in my guest room while she rebuilt. Found a new job, saved a deposit, got back on her feet. I gave her the code to my front door and the combination to my closet safe during that stretch, because she needed access to the house when I was traveling for site visits, and because it never once occurred to me that trust had an expiration date I was supposed to set myself. That was also the year she met Marcus. He was doing finish carpentry on a renovation 2 doors down from a friend of mine, the kind of guy who could charm a room and quote a job low enough to win it, then somehow still come out behind on the labor. He started his own general contracting business not long after they got married, and for a while it looked like it might actually work. Then, a development deal he'd leveraged himself into went sideways. A permitting delay, a partner who pulled out, a private lender who didn't care about either of those things when payments came due. I didn't know the specifics back then. I know them now. Underneath all of it was our grandmother, Eleanor. She was the one who taught me what a level and a plumb line were before I was 10, the one who used to say, "A house built crooked will always find a way to tell you about it eventually, usually at the worst time." When her health started failing, congestive heart failure, then the slower decline that comes after, Paige did the part I couldn't. She lived 40 minutes from Grandma Eleanor. I lived 2 states away. Paige drove her to appointments, sat with her during the bad nights, managed the rotation of home health aides when we could afford them, and filled in herself when we couldn't. I flew in when I could. I paid for things Paige's budget couldn't stretch to cover. And I told myself that counted as equal effort. It didn't. Not really. And some part of me has always known that. What I didn't know, until the will was read, was that Grandma Eleanor had noticed something in those final 2 years that neither of us said out loud. Paige's care had become exhausted, resentful, transactional in a way that broke my grandmother's heart more than her own failing body did. Not because Paige didn't love her, but because love that's been asked to carry too much for too long starts to curdle into something that looks like duty instead. Me, showing up 4 times a year with a checkbook and clean hands, got to stay soft. Paige, doing the daily, grinding work of watching someone die slowly, got hardened by it. My grandmother saw both versions of love and made a choice neither of us expected. The brooch was named specifically in a personal property memorandum attached to her will, a separate signed list specifying exactly who got which keepsakes. So there'd be no ambiguity, no fighting after she was gone. Next to my name, she'd written one line the estate attorney read aloud at the table. For Claire, who builds things meant to last. Nothing was written next to Paige's name for the brooch. Paige got the house in the mountains, the one Grandma Eleanor actually lived in longest, which on paper was worth far more. It didn't matter. The brooch wasn't about money to either of us, and Paige's face when that line was read told me she understood exactly what our grandmother meant by it, and exactly how much it cost her not to have earned it the same way. I told myself that was old grief talking. I told myself it was over. Looking back, the warnings were there. I just filed them under the wrong heading. About 6 weeks before the trip to Aspen, Paige invited me to dinner. Just the two of us, which was rare enough on its own that I should have noticed. She picked a restaurant nicer than either of us usually chose, and halfway through the appetizer she asked, almost offhand, whether I'd ever had the brooch reappraised since Grandma Eleanor passed. I said no. The original appraisal was still current. Why? She shrugged and said she'd just been thinking about Grandma a lot lately. I believed her. Grief doesn't run on a schedule, and I'd had plenty of months where some ordinary object turned into a wave I didn't see coming. 2 weeks after that, Marcus showed up at my house unannounced on a Saturday morning, told me he was in the neighborhood checking on a client's project and wanted to see how I'd finished out my own primary suite since he'd helped rough in the electrical back when I bought the place. I let him in. We talked for maybe 20 minutes. About the closet renovation, about the safe I'd had bolted into the wall, about how solid the install was. I remember being proud of that wall. I remember him running his hand along the trim like he was admiring craftsmanship. And I didn't think anything of it, because he was a contractor, and contractors look at walls the way I look at buildings. Automatically, professionally, the way some people can't help reading every menu in a restaurant even when they're not hungry. What I didn't know was that 3 weeks before that visit, Marcus had missed a payment to a private lender named Holloway Capital Partners, a hard money outfit that had financed the back half of a townhome development he'd taken on a loan after his business partner walked away mid-project. The loan had a clause Marcus hadn't read closely enough, a default trigger that accelerated the entire remaining balance the moment one payment came in late by more than 10 days. I found this out much later, in a folder a detective eventually showed me, but by the time Marcus stood in my closet doorway admiring my trim work, he was already 11 days past due on a loan that, fully accelerated, came to just under $90,000. I also didn't know that Paige had started a part-time bookkeeping job for the lender's office 2 months earlier, a job Marcus had quietly suggested she apply for, not because she needed it, but because it put her inside a building where she'd occasionally overhear which clients were behind, and how aggressive Holloway's collections process tended to get once a borrower crossed 90 days. She told me about the job the same dinner she asked about the brooch. I remember being happy for her. I remember thinking, finally, something steady. The Thursday before I left for Aspen, my mother called to ask if I'd given Paige a key back when she moved out, or if she'd just kept the spare. I told her I honestly didn't remember, that Paige had her own set for the 8 months she lived with me, and once she found her own apartment, I never thought to ask for it back. Because why would I? My mother said something about how it was probably fine. Families share keys. And I agreed with her, because it was an ordinary conversation about an ordinary thing, and I had a flight to catch in the morning. I left for Aspen on a Monday. I told Paige, the way I told most of my family, because she'd asked the week before whether I had any travel coming up. She said she was thinking about getting back into hiking and wanted recommendations near wherever I was headed next. I gave her my dates without a second thought. I told her exactly when I'd be back. I almost didn't call it in that night. Some old, well-worn part of me wanted to handle it quietly, the way our family always handled things. Make a phone call, ask a careful question, let whoever it was put it back before anyone official got involved. I sat with that instinct for almost 20 minutes before I recognized it for what it was. The same instinct that had let 8 months turn into 3 years without anyone changing a combination. I called the non-emergency line because nothing was actively happening, and the dispatcher was clear that an officer would still be sent out to take a report. 2 patrol officers arrived a little after 1 in the morning. The older one introduced himself as Officer Doherty and spent most of the visit asking careful, procedural questions, while his partner photographed the open safe, the undisturbed coat hangers around it, the absence of any pry marks on the steel door or its frame. No forced entry, Doherty said, not as an accusation, just as a fact he was writing down. Front door, same thing? I told him about the code in the app log, the one I didn't recognize, active for 30 seconds, then deactivated. He nodded like he'd seen that pattern before. Smart locks remember every code anyone's ever programmed in, unless you go back and manually delete them. People think changing the master code resets everything. It doesn't. If somebody had a 4-digit code from 3 years ago and nobody ever pulled it from the system, it still works today. That was the first time I understood, in a concrete and procedural way, exactly how this had happened. He asked who'd had access to the house in the past. I gave him the honest version. My sister. For the 8 months she'd lived with me. The door code and the safe combination both, and that I'd never revoked either. He explained in the flat, practiced tone of someone who'd had this conversation more than once, that under Colorado law, what mattered wasn't whether the code still technically worked. It was whether the person using it still had lawful permission to be in the house. Once Paige moved out, any standing invitation to enter on her own, unannounced, while I was gone, had ended. Whether or not anyone had said those words out loud. Entering a residence without consent, with the intent to take property once inside, met the elements of first-degree burglary in Colorado, regardless of whether a door was kicked in or a 4-digit code was calmly typed into a keypad. The method of entry didn't determine the crime. The absence of permission did. I'm not saying it's your sister, he added, watching my face carefully. I'm saying whoever had that code is the first place this investigation starts. And I'd rather hear that from you now than have you protect somebody and regret it in 6 months. I gave them the appraisal documents that night. 3 separate evaluations going back over a decade. The most recent one done the year after Grandma Eleanor passed, listing the brooch's metal content, the cut and approximate carat weight of the center sapphire, the diamond melee surrounding it, and a GIA report number from when it had been reset into its current setting. I gave them photographs from 4 different angles, the kind my insurance company had required for the rider I'd taken out separately from my homeowner's policy. Doherty looked almost relieved going through the folder. Most people don't have half of this, he said. This is going to make recovery a lot more realistic than it usually is. A detective named Lena Brandt called me the following afternoon to introduce herself as the one taking over the case. She was direct in a way I appreciated immediately. No false comfort, no promises she couldn't keep. Just a clear explanation that she'd be pulling full doorbell and interior camera logs going back 2 weeks before my trip, cross-referencing every code used against the names I'd given her, and that if the item surfaced anywhere, it would legally have to be sold. A pawn shop, a consignment jeweler, an online resale platform with ID verification. There were reporting requirements that would very likely flag it before it ever reached a stranger's hands. I called my business partner Priya before I called my parents. She came over at 2 in the morning without being asked twice, sat with me on the closet floor where this whole night had started, and said the thing I hadn't let myself say yet out loud. "You already know it's her, don't you?" I didn't answer. I didn't have to. I didn't call Paige that night. I waited 2 days, partly on Detective Brandt's advice. Give us time to pull what we can before anyone knows we're looking. And partly because some part of me still needed to believe there was an explanation that didn't end the way I already suspected it would. I invited her to lunch instead of confronting her over the phone because I wanted to see her face when I asked. We met at a place near her office, the same building I now knew, where Holloway Capital Partners leased the 3rd floor. She ordered first, talked about a hiking trail she'd tried near Estes Park, asked how Aspen had gone. I let her finish before I set my phone on the table, the security app open to the single 30-second entry from the afternoon I was gone. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to actually answer me," I said. "Were you at my house while I was in Aspen?" She didn't flinch the way I expected. She looked almost relieved, like she'd been carrying the question longer than I had. "Yes," she said. "I went to get something that was supposed to be mine." Not, "I'm sorry." Not, "I don't know what you're talking about." Just a flat admission delivered like a closing argument she'd rehearsed. "The brooch isn't yours, Paige. Grandma Eleanor wrote your name on a list with mine right next to it. She knew exactly what she was doing." "She knew exactly what she was doing," Paige repeated, and her voice cracked on the word "knew" in a way that told me this had been sitting in her for years, not weeks. I spent 2 years of my life watching her die a little more every week. I quit a job I liked because the new one let me leave early for her appointments. I was there at 3 in the morning when she didn't know her own name anymore. "Claire, not you. You flew in for the easy parts and flew back out before the hard ones started. And she gave you the one thing in that house everyone always said was worth something. That's not what the brooch was about, and you know it. I don't know it. I know what it looked like from where I was standing, which was on my knees, every single day, for 2 years." Her hands were shaking around her water glass. "Marcus told me I was being a coward, just asking you nicely and accepting whatever answer you gave me. He said I'd already earned it 10 times over and I shouldn't have to beg for something that should have come to me without a fight." That was the first time Marcus's name came up as something more than a bystander, and I felt the shape of the afternoon shift under me. What does Marcus have to do with any of this? Paige's composure finally cracked, and what came out wasn't an answer so much as a confession she could no longer hold back on her own. Marcus's development deal had collapsed 8 months earlier when his partner pulled out mid-construction, leaving him personally liable for a loan he'd taken from Holloway Capital Partners against two unfinished townhomes. The loan had a default acceleration clause, miss one payment by more than 10 days, and the entire remaining balance comes due immediately, no negotiation, no grace period. He'd missed it. By the time I left for Aspen, the full balance, just under $90,000, was already in Holloway's hands, and the private lender's collections process, the one Paige now knew intimately from her desk on the third floor, did not wait politely for people to find the money on their own. He said if we sold it quietly, nobody would even know it was missing for months, Paige said. He said it was an heirloom, not evidence, that nobody reports a missing piece of jewelry the way they report a stolen car. He said you'd never even think to look at me first. Before I tell you what I said back to her, because there's a version of me that wanted to forgive her on the spot, and a version that wanted to walk out without another word, I want to ask you something. If your siblings stood in front of you and told you they'd earned the right to take something that was never legally theirs, would you have let the conversation end there? Or would you have kept pushing until you got the whole truth? I kept pushing. Where is it now? I said. Not a question, a demand. Paige went very still. I don't know, she said. Marcus took it to sell 2 days ago. He wouldn't tell me where. I called Detective Brandt from the parking lot before I'd even started my car. She didn't sound surprised, which told me she'd already been circling the same name from a different direction. We pulled the doorbell footage this morning, she said. Vehicle matching your brother-in-law's truck. 11 minutes total, the day you flagged. We're already ahead of where I expected to be by this point in a case like this. What she told me next was the part I hadn't understood until that afternoon. That recovering a stolen piece of jewelry almost never happens because police go looking for it. It happens because the item tries to surface, and a paper trail is already waiting when it does. In Colorado, like most states, licensed pawnbrokers and secondhand jewelry dealers are legally required to record every transaction. The seller's government ID, a detailed description of the item, and, in most jurisdictions, photographs, and report that information to local law enforcement, often within 24 hours, sometimes through a shared statewide database that every department in the metro area can search. On top of that, state law requires a mandatory holding period, typically somewhere between 15 and 30 days depending on the municipality, before a purchased item can legally be resold. The system isn't built to stop a theft. It's built to make a thief's window small enough that the property is still sitting in a back room when the report catches up to it. Because I'd handed Doherty a full folder the first night. 3 appraisals, GIA documentation, photographs from 4 angles, even the specific carat weight and clarity grade of the center sapphire. Brandt had been able to push a detailed alert to every licensed pawnbroker and jewelry buyer within a 60-mile radius within hours of opening the case, well before Paige ever told me Marcus had already taken it to sell. Most jewelers, she said, run a quick visual check against active alerts before they'll even quote a price on an unusual estate piece, because getting caught, buying a flagged item, even unknowingly, can cost them their license. While that net was already in place, Brandt had pulled financial records on Marcus through a subpoena tied to the burglary investigation, not the full scope a fraud case would require, but enough to confirm the shape of what Paige had told me at lunch. Holloway Capital Partners had filed a notice of default on the townhome loan 6 weeks earlier. The accelerated balance, with penalties and accruing interest, now sat at just over $94,000. Marcus had missed 2 follow-up payment plan deadlines Holloway had quietly offered him, the kind lenders extend when they'd rather collect slowly than force a borrower into bankruptcy and collect nothing. He'd missed both. People assume desperation makes someone careless in obvious ways, Brandt told me. Usually it's the opposite. It makes them careful about the wrong things. He probably spent a week thinking about how to avoid your security cameras and never once thought about the appraisal paperwork sitting in your insurance file. She asked me one more question before we hung up. Whether Paige had said anything about which jewelers or pawn shops Marcus might already be approaching, even secondhand. I told her what little I had, that Marcus did most of his supply runs for jobs somewhere along the south end of the metro area, that he'd know that part of town better than anywhere downtown. 2 days later, Brant called again, this time with something closer to certainty in her voice. A jewelry buyer on that exact stretch had flagged a walk-in from the previous afternoon, a man matching Marcus's description, trying to sell a vintage sapphire and diamond brooch, no provenance paperwork, vague answers about where it came from. The buyer hadn't completed the transaction. State law required an ID copy and a description logged before any cash changed hands, and something about the inconsistency in his story had been enough for the buyer to stall him, take his information, and quietly check the regional alert system before committing to anything. The match came back within minutes. "He's coming back tomorrow to finalize the sale," Brant said. "The buyer's cooperating. We'll be there." Brant called the next morning and asked if I wanted to be nearby when it happened. Not in the room, not anywhere near the actual exchange, but close enough that once Marcus was in custody, and the brooch was secured as evidence, I could come in and formally identify it on the spot, rather than waiting days for it to clear through evidence processing. I said yes before she'd finished the sentence. I sat in a coffee shop 2 doors down from the jewelry buyer's storefront for 40 minutes that felt like 4 hours. I watched through the window as an unmarked car pulled into the side lot. I watched Marcus's truck pull in 11 minutes later, exactly on time. The same casual confidence he'd worn the morning he stood in my closet doorway, admiring my trim work. I didn't see what happened inside. Brant told me afterward, piece by piece, once it was over. Marcus had walked in, brooch in a folded paper bag, no box, no provenance, ready to finally close out a sale that had stalled the day before. The buyer, working exactly as instructed, stepped into the back office under the excuse of checking with my appraiser, which was the cue for 2 plainclothes officers waiting there to step out instead. Marcus didn't run. Brant said most people don't. Not really. The moment catches up with them too fast for their body to decide on anything but stillness. What he said, almost immediately, was the line that told me everything about how he'd built a story he could live with. "This isn't stealing. It's family property. Ask her. Ask Claire. She's got more than she'll ever need, and we needed it for one loan payment. This is insane." He wasn't arguing he hadn't taken it. He was arguing it shouldn't count. They read him his rights, walked him out the side entrance away from the front windows, and that's when Paige arrived. Brant thought someone must have called her, though no one on the police side had. She stood on the sidewalk in work clothes, watching her husband get put into the back of an unmarked car, and for a moment she didn't move at all. Like the whole scene was happening behind glass she hadn't agreed to look through yet. Brant came to get me a few minutes later. I walked into the back office where the brooch sat on a velvet evidence pad, photographed from 4 angles the same way my insurance file had instructed years before any of this happened, now serving a very different purpose than the one I'd imagined when I filled out that paperwork. I confirmed it was mine. I confirmed the GIA report number matched. I signed where Brant told me to sign, and my hand was steadier than I expected it to be. Outside, Paige was waiting by my car, not Marcus's. I almost didn't stop. "He's going to say I knew everything," she said, before I'd even unlocked the door. "He's going to say it was my idea because I'm the one who told him about the combination, and maybe he's right to say that. I don't know anymore. Did you know he was going to sell it? Today? Specifically?" She hesitated long enough that the hesitation was its own answer. "He told me last night he had a buyer. I told him not to. I want you to believe that, even if it doesn't matter anymore." It matters to me, I said. It's not going to matter the same way to a prosecutor. She flinched like I'd hit her, which I understood, because in a way I had. Under Colorado law, what Paige had told me at lunch 2 days earlier, the admission that she'd entered the house, taken the brooch herself, and known Marcus intended to sell it, wasn't a private family confession anymore. It was the kind of statement a detective would eventually need from me, whether I wanted to give it or not. "You're going to tell them what I said," she said. It wasn't really a question. I didn't answer her on that sidewalk. I got in my car, the brooch sealed in an evidence bag on the passenger seat beside me until it could be officially released, and I drove home to a house that didn't feel entirely mine again yet. My mother found out before I had the chance to call her because Paige called our parents from her own car before she'd even left the parking lot. By the time I walked through my front door, there were 4 missed calls and a voicemail from my father that started with, "Claire, what is going on?" in a voice I hadn't heard him use since my grandmother's diagnosis. We met at my parents' kitchen table 2 nights later. Me, my mother, my father, Paige. Marcus wasn't there. He'd been released on bond the day after his arrest, charged with first-degree residential burglary and theft, both felonies under Colorado law given the value of the brooch and the fact that the home was occupied territory he had no current right to enter, regardless of whether a door had been forced. His attorney had already told him, through Paige, not to discuss the case with anyone, which meant the version of events I got that night came entirely from her. My mother started by asking if there was any way to make this go away quietly, and I understood, watching my father's face fall at the question, that she was still operating in the old family logic. The one where a phone call and a careful silence fixed everything. The same logic that had let a 4-digit code sit active in my system for 3 years longer than it should have. "It's not going away quietly," I said. "There's a police report. There's an arrest. There's evidence with my name on it. This isn't a conversation we get to manage anymore." Paige had been quiet since she sat down, turning a mug of coffee she wasn't drinking in slow half circles on the table. When she finally spoke, it wasn't the version of the story she'd given Marcus's defense, and it wasn't entirely the version she'd given me on the sidewalk either. "I didn't go there to steal anything to sell," she said. "I want you to understand that part, even if nobody else ever does. I went there because I'd spent 2 years telling myself I deserved something, anything, with her name attached to it. And the one thing that had her name attached to it went to you instead. I told myself I was just going to take it for a little while. Hold it. Maybe wear it once. I told myself I'd put it back before you even got home." "And then what happened?" my father asked, quiet in a way that wasn't really a question. "Marcus saw it in my bag that night. He asked where it came from. I told him the truth because I'd never lied to him about anything, and within an hour he wasn't talking about holding on to it anymore. He was talking about Holloway, about the loan, about how this could fix everything in one transaction if I just let it." Her voice cracked on the word let, like she'd only just heard herself say it out loud. I told him no. I told him a dozen times. And then I didn't stop him, because some part of me had already decided that if it disappeared into his problem instead of staying in my conscience, I wouldn't have to be the one who took it from you. I could just be the one who didn't know where it went. That distinction mattered more than she probably understood when she said it. It was the difference, Detective Brandt later explained to me, between what Paige would likely be charged with and what Marcus already had been. Paige's attorney was negotiating a plea to a single count of criminal trespass and conspiracy to commit theft, a felony, but a lesser one, reflecting that she'd taken the item herself, but hadn't been the one who moved to sell it, and that she'd verbally objected, even if she hadn't physically stopped it. Marcus, who'd carried it to a buyer with full knowledge of what it was and where it came from, was facing the burglary charge in full, with prosecutors signaling they had no interest in reducing it, given his attempt to sell stolen property within days of taking it. I'm not asking you to forgive either of us tonight, Paige said. I know what entitled looks like from the outside. I've thought about it every hour since Brant called me. But I need you to know there's a difference between believing you earned something and deciding to sell it to a stranger for cash. I only ever did the first one. I let him do the second. My mother started to say something about how surely that difference mattered. Surely the courts would see it the way our family saw it. And I had to stop her there. Gently. Because I understood something my mother still didn't. It does matter, I said. It's going to matter to a judge. And it should. But it doesn't undo what already happened in my closet at midnight. And it's not my job to decide whether 2 years of caregiving makes that okay. That's not mine to forgive on Grandma's behalf. It's only mine to forgive on my own. Marcus pled guilty 4 months later to a reduced burglary charge, the prosecutor accepting the plea in exchange for full restitution and a sentencing structure that kept him out of state prison, but put him through a community corrections program, 5 years of probation, and mandatory restitution. Not just for the value of the brooch, but for the cost of repairing a small abrasion near the clasp, damage the jeweler's appraisal had flagged from being carried loose in a paper bag instead of its case. Paige's attorney negotiated her plea to criminal trespass and conspiracy, a felony but a lesser one, resulting in probation, community service, and a restitution order she insisted on paying entirely herself, separate from anything tied to Marcus's case. They separated 5 months after the arrest. I don't know everything that happened between them, and I've stopped asking. Some structures fail because of one bad beam, and some fail because two people built on a foundation neither of them ever tested properly before they stood on it. I had the brooch reappraised and restored within a month of getting it back. The jeweler who did the work was the same one Brant's office had used to verify the GIA documentation, and when I told him the short version of how it had come back to me, he said something I've thought about often since. Most heirlooms outlive the stories behind them. The stones don't remember who held them. People do. None. I changed every code in my house that same week, not just the ones Paige had known, all of them. The whole system reset from the ground up. And I've since made it a rule I should have had from the beginning. Access doesn't expire on its own. Someone has to choose to end it, on purpose, the same way they chose to grant it. Paige and I talk now, carefully, the way you'd cross a floor you're not entirely sure is load-bearing yet. She's in therapy, working through what she called, in one of our harder conversations, 2 years of grief I never let myself feel until it turned into something I'm ashamed of. I believe she means that. I'm not ready to hand her a key to anything yet, and she's never once asked me to. I still have the brooch. I've thought more than once about having a second one made. Not identical, never identical, but something of my own design, in my grandmother's honor, for whichever of us is still standing close enough to deserve it when that day comes. I haven't decided yet. Some decisions shouldn't be rushed, just because the story around them already has an ending. If you'd been the one standing in that closet doorway at midnight, finding an empty velvet box where something irreplaceable used to sit, would you have pressed full charges against your own sister, or would you have found a quieter way to handle it, even knowing she might never truly answer for what she took? Thank you for staying with this story until the end. Please remember that the names, events, and circumstances depicted here are entirely fictional, created for dramatic and entertainment purposes, and are not based on any real individuals. If this story resonated with you, we hope it's a reminder that the people we trust most don't get a permanent exemption from honesty, and that protecting what matters to you is never something you need to apologize for.